She became the standard by which all North Carolina storms are judged, Hurricane Hazel. With 140-mile-per-hour winds and a surge of nearly 18 feet, Hazel remains the only storm to make landfall here as a Category 4. But hidden away in the history books, there's another storm that nearly stole that title, Hurricane Helene. She was stronger than Hazel, and were it not for a rather unique chain of events, Helene would have taken our state down a much darker path. The story of Hurricane Helene begins thousands of miles away near the Cape Verde Islands. Here, low-pressure troughs, commonly called tropical waves, develop and travel westward. Given the right conditions, they can organize into clusters of thunderstorms. Helene is believed to have started as a tropical wave like this one. But to get the whole story, we need to travel back in time nearly 60 years. A simpler time, which made things more, well, complicated.
I'm Vincent Price. What unearthly horror did that girl gaze upon? What manner of incredible thing walked beneath that hood?
In 1958, movie audiences flocked to see the latest creature features. From The Fly to The Blob, Hollywood was obsessed with the idea of science gone wrong. But in the real world, science was evolving. NASA was officially established on July 29th with the goal of exploring space. The ability to see Earth from orbit was important to meteorologists, but it would be well into the 1960s before the first weather satellites came online. Of course, this was little help to forecasters in the 1958 hurricane season. It's hard for us to imagine a time without satellite pictures. If a storm forms over the ocean today, you can just track it right on your cell phone. But in 1958, a hurricane had to pass by a radar to be seen, and most of these were on land or nearby craft. In other words, a storm had to be in the right place at the right time. So forecasters didn't always have the most up-to-date images. And it's hard to predict how a storm will develop in the future if you can't see what it looks like in the present. By mid-September of 1958, 8 named storms had already formed, with 4 becoming hurricanes. North Carolina had been spared from landfall so far. But on September 20th, 1958, ships near the Leeward Islands reported heavy rain and falling air pressure. Although they didn't realize it at the time, these captains were dangerously close to what would become the strongest hurricane of the season.
Hurricanes are simply a natural part of life in our state, but not every season brings a storm. And even in the busy years, the main threat is confined to a specific period of time. Although the season officially runs from June through November, most North Carolina storms strike in August or early to mid-September. By September 23, 1958, the peak of the season had passed and October was just over a week away. The kids were back in school, summer visitors had left, and residents embraced autumn. But forecasters had their eye on the ocean and a new tropical storm called Helene. The idea of assigning a name to a tropical storm is something we take for granted. But believe it or not, there was a time when storms were not named. In the earliest days of tracking, systems were recorded simply by latitude and longitude. This became rather confusing since a dozen or more storms can form in any given year. Over time, forecasters named storms after towns, holidays, and even saints. In the early 1950s, the United States used the phonetic alphabet to name storms. By 1953, forecasters used a list comprised of female names, and this method seemed to work. Decades later, male names were incorporated into the list, and we still rotate names even today. A developing tropical system is assigned a name when core sustained winds reach 39 miles an hour. On September 23, 1958, Tropical Storm Helene continued to organize. She drew strength from the warm waters east of the Bahamas and quickly became a hurricane the following day. But that all-important question remained, where was she headed next? Hurricanes don't always move under their own power. They're guided by weather systems around them. Some weather systems, like the Bermuda or Azores high pressure system, don't move very much. Winds travel clockwise around these systems, guiding the storms across the Atlantic. A hurricane is perfectly content to follow that path until another system, like a cold front, comes along to change it. For nearly 3 days, Helene pushed towards the North Carolina coast. All hope of the storm turning back out to sea faded, and warnings were hoisted from Georgia to the Outer Banks. To make matters worse, Helene was slowing down. This allowed her to tap into the warm waters of the Gulf Stream.
You're absolutely right, Dante. The Gulf Stream is a warm, swift ocean current found off the southeast U.S. coast. Hurricanes use warm water for fuel, and the Gulf Stream has a rich supply. Storms that linger near the Gulf Stream can strengthen rapidly, and that's exactly what happened with Helene. By September 26th, she reached Category 3 status and showed no signs of weakness. The outermost rain bands could clearly be seen on local radars, and the path was unchanged. By the next day, Hurricane Helene reached Category 4 intensity. With wind gusts topping 150 miles an hour and an air pressure of 27.46 inches, she had become more powerful than Hurricane Hazel. The relationship between wind speed and damage potential is not linear. For example, the damage produced by a Category 4 is not simply double the damage of a Category 2, it's much worse. Researchers with the National Hurricane Center have determined the relationship is exponential. In other words, the damage produced by a strong Category 4 hurricane can be 250 times greater than a weak Category 1. In September of 1958, Helene's Category 4I was aimed at the North Carolina coast, and locals braced for an unprecedented hit. But this story doesn't proceed the way you might think. Helene was about to write a far different ending than anyone could have ever imagined. If you've ever tracked a hurricane, you know how easy it is to get caught up in the hype. From bogus forecasting sites to so-called experts with random Twitter accounts, there's so many sources of misinformation it's hard to separate fact from fiction. But even with the limitations of social media, there's one thing for certain. If a hurricane is coming, you'll hear about it. In the 1950s, communication was a little more cumbersome. Oh, you could see a storm report on television or hear about it on the radio, but there really wasn't a 24-hour news cycle like today. Sometimes it actually took a knock on the door to get the word out, especially when it came to evacuations. Of course, experience is the best teacher. As Hurricane Helene approached the Carolinas on September 26, 1958, many recalled the lessons of Hurricane Hazel 4 years earlier. Helene would be a stronger storm, so residents obeyed evacuation orders. Those who did stay boarded their homes as best they could. There are few sights as intimidating as the eye of a hurricane on radar, especially if it's looking at you. Helene was closing in. The time for preparation was over. Residents waited for the worst. And then, quite suddenly, everything changed. Just when landfall seemed unavoidable, a nearby trough finally pushed eastward. Helene's track was shifting with it. Early morning updates on September 27th confirmed the hurricane was turning sharply northeast. Forecasters scrambled to extend warnings, fearing that Helene would landfall farther north. The eye pulled dangerously close to Cape Fear, passing offshore by only 20 miles. But the northeast turn held true. The eye ran parallel to the coast, missing every community along the way. The story of Hurricane Helene is a good lesson in the importance of eye placement.
That's right, Jerry. Consider a typical hurricane moving northward. On the right side of the storm, forward motion and counterclockwise circulation combine for a greater push of water and wind, and the tornado potential is higher. On the left side of center, the wind and surge potential is much less. In other words, the weather 60 miles to the east of center can be much worse than the weather 60 miles to the west of center. Helene's close path near the North Carolina coast kept the strongest winds and surge offshore, but our state was certainly not spared from problems. After all, a hurricane is more than just a single dot on a map. Rain bands can extend many miles from the center. Wilmington recorded an all-time wind gust of 135 miles per hour with Helene, a record which still stands. Much higher wind gusts were reported at the beaches, but not officially verified. Of course, it's often the storm surge that causes the most damage. But in the case of Helene, timing was in our favor. She made her approach near low tide. In the absence of landfall, this helped reduce some of the water rise. But significant flooding still occurred in some communities, especially near the southern end of Pamlico Sound. In total, Helene leveled over $11 million in damage in our state. And remember, damage can come in many forms. We usually think of structural damage, but agricultural losses are a possibility with any hurricane. Erosion and shifting can occur near the coast, sometimes taking months to repair. The damage to power and phone lines can also be extreme, and obviously this affects communication. Hurricanes can also bring economic impacts due to lost time. Every day a business is closed, money is lost. By the time Hurricane Helene finally pushed away on September 28th, storm-weary residents had had enough. But Helene left us with new lessons we still follow today.
When we study North Carolina hurricanes, we often focus on the storms that actually made landfall, and we have a lot to choose from. Bertha, Fran, Diana, just to name a few. But for every storm that actually hit, there are many more that could have. You know, it's a common misconception that a forecaster's job is easier if a storm doesn't make landfall. In truth, forecasters put in just as much work for a near miss, like Hurricane Helene, as we do for a direct hit. If you think about it, we can't play chicken with an incoming storm. We have to have contingencies in place just in case it does strike. Typically, we have about 1 to 2 weeks in which to track a hurricane. So each night at 2 a.m. just before bed, I'll sit down and prepare a weather briefing containing the latest forecast tracks and graphics so that our managers have something fresh to look at first thing in the morning. Our parent company, Nexstar Media Group, owns or operates television stations throughout the country. So we'll usually be on conference call before lunch, sharing ideas and pooling resources for coverage. By 1 p.m., we're in the studio preparing for our 2:30 hurricane briefing. Here, we talk logistics, where to deploy reporters, technical preparations like fuel and generator backups, equipment checks, computer maintenance. By 3:15, it's time to record promos for the newscast so viewers can know what to expect. Then it's time to assemble the show rundown and update our website with the latest video forecast. By 4 p.m., we're pushing the latest updates to Facebook and Twitter. We also have a network of radio partners, so we record updates for them as well. The latest coordinates from the National Hurricane Center usually come down at 4:45, so we have to build them into our show, which starts at 5 o'clock. For the next hour and a half, we're giving the latest storm information on air. After a quick dinner at 7, it's time to update the evening Facebook and Twitter feeds, post new tracks to the web, and talk to our viewers via Facebook Live. It's also a good time to create a few new graphics for the night shows, which start at 10 on the CW and 11 p.m. on WNCT. At midnight, I'll leave forecast notes for the morning team and meet with the overnight producer to answer any questions. Before you know it, it's 2 a.m. again. Time for one final email briefing for the managers and then to bed. So you see, by the time a storm is within striking distance of our coast, that hurricane takes up every thought of the day for a meteorologist. That's why it takes a whole team to get it done right, and I'm blessed to work with a talented crew. Meteorologist Dante Jones is our primary morning meteorologist. He's got a natural ease on air and has calmly navigated our viewers through many storms. Meteorologist Megan Lindsay is our primary weekend meteorologist. She brings a new generation of social media to the table and excels at severe weather coverage on air and online. Of course, meteorologist David Sawyer has been through the worst weather in North Carolina history. His expertise is invaluable in storm coverage. Our weather team has over 50 years of combined forecasting experience right here in eastern North Carolina. And it's not just the meteorologists, reporters, producers, engineers, directors, our GM, news director, our entire staff. Of course, WNCT 9 on Your Side is only one part of a larger team.
Good point, Jerry. First responders, law enforcement, government forecasters, military and civilian leaders, power and cleanup crews, medical personnel, all play a part. Remember, it's the experience with past hurricanes that makes it easier to plan for the future. Consider Hurricane Helene. When she approached in 1958, the lessons learned from Hurricane Hazel 4 years earlier probably saved lives. Evacuations were more efficient, forecasts were better. One of the most important lessons to learn from any hurricane is that damage is not just a function of strength. For example, Hurricane Helene and 2016's Hurricane Matthew moved into similar positions off our coast. Helene was a much stronger storm, which may lead you to believe the flooding was worse. But a stronger storm tends to be more tightly wrapped, decreasing the overall coverage of rain. With a weaker system like Matthew, rain bands unravel over a much larger area, leading to more widespread flooding. And don't forget, the weeks leading up to Matthew had already been excessively wet, so there was nowhere for the water to go. Hurricane Helene's 8+ inches of rain certainly caused some flooding, but it paled by comparison to the records set by Matthew. Every hurricane story is unique, and many endure for a lifetime.
No matter how many times you see it, the power of a hurricane is awe-inspiring, and the images speak for themselves. Hurricanes like Helene just don't simply disappear after leaving North Carolina. The leftovers have to go somewhere. Helene accelerated to the northeast in late September of 1958, weakening over cooler waters on approach to Newfoundland. Although she was losing tropical structure, Helene still managed to produce gale-force winds and dangerous seas. Like many dying hurricanes, Helene eventually merged with other weather features, which carried the system back across the Atlantic. She finally dissipated for good near Great Britain in early October. 60 years have passed since Hurricane Helene visited our shores, and it may surprise you to know that her name was never retired. In fact, the name Helene appears on the 2018 storm list. I've heard several theories as to why this is the case. For one thing, Helene technically never made landfall in the United States. Also, the list of human casualties doesn't quite match those of other hurricanes. Frankly, Helene is eclipsed by other monster storms from the early 1950s. She's almost become a hidden footnote in the history books. But for those who experienced Helene, well, those are stories you tend to remember. From all of us here at WNCT 9 on your side and the First Alert Weather Team, I'm Chief Meteorologist Jerry Jackson. Thank you for joining us.